Welcome to Advice for Grad Students. I'm your host, Phil Haun. I'm an MIT alum, and I have with me today a fellow alum, Peter Krause, who's an associate professor at Boston College. Peter, welcome to Advice for Grad Students.
Great to be with you, Phil. Looking forward to engaging with MIT grad students again.
All right, excellent. And today's topic is co-authorship and collaboration. It's a great topic, but the question I have, Peter, is why in the world did you pick this topic to talk about?
Yeah, I picked it in part because some of my greatest experiences as a grad student and as a professor have been co-authoring with others and co-editing with others. But I also think that there are a number of things that grad students need to consider both right now and in the future before they dive into a co-authorship or a collaborative agreement to do research. And so I'm looking forward to talking about both the positives and the challenges today.
All right, well, I've enjoyed being on a project with you, and the advice you gave me for an edited volume was extremely useful. So I can't wait to see what you have to say on this topic.
Awesome. Well, yeah, that was a great experience. I will be talking a bit about that. So let's just step back for a minute and talk about co-authorship and collaboration in general. So one of the first things I'll say is since my time at MIT, which I'm scared to say is now almost 20 years ago when I was a grad student, I think co-authorship has become more of a norm. It's not that it didn't exist when you and I were in grad school. It's just political science is somewhat mimicking or following a lot of the other social sciences or medical sciences where you see not just co-authorship being more common, but maybe co-authorship with not just two people, sometimes three or four or five people being more common. So I'll just say in general for grad students, we should think about this as something that is increasingly happening and you'll probably be part of, maybe even more so early in your career than you were before. So just a general point. Now, one of the first things I think before we get into how you do good co-authorship or collaboration is thinking about the positives and negatives of both solo individual work and co-authorship. So first on the solo side, right? If you're doing the work yourself, it's like, okay, it's all your work. In terms of people considering it for tenure, otherwise, they're not going to be giving shared credit, et cetera. They're going to be like, you did everything. And it also forces you to hone your skills at all parts of research, right? Posing an interesting question, generating original arguments, creating quality research designs, carrying out research and analysis, writing it up, going through the review process. If it's solo, you're doing all those things, with some support from your friends and colleagues and talking to them, but you're the main person doing it. Now, the negatives, right? It's lots of work to do everything yourself. You might not be the very best in all parts of the project, right? You might not have all the method skills you want or whatever else. And you don't necessarily make connections in the same way when you're just doing the work by yourself. Okay, co-authorship, right? Positives, less work, but really slightly less work. Don't ever think, okay, I've got one co-author, that's half the work. No. There's a great saying, individually we go faster, together we go further. And I agree with that, right? When you're by yourself, you don't have to, unless you're having these internal dialogues, which I guess we all do as academics. But when you're working with someone else, you have to constantly discuss, debate, sometimes disagree about, how to structure this section. Everything that's written, someone else is reading it, editing it back. So it can often take longer and be almost as much work as individuals. But other positives, right? You learn from people along the way. You learn about their research process. You pick up insights about how they do work. And that can benefit you not just on that project, but for the rest of your career. And I also think you make strong, sometimes lifelong connections. No scholar is this great person just by themselves. They're going to have a network of people around them whose work they engage with, who they understand, who they learn from. And co-authorship is a great way indirectly to kind of help form and strengthen those bonds. Now, the negatives, it is important to understand that for some people, they will look at a co-authored project and they'll still say, this is great, you were part of this, you get credit for this, but they might not give you the same credit as if it was just you writing individually, especially as I'll talk about later, if there's power dynamics there, if you're writing with your advisor or something. And again, that doesn't mean that's the right way to perceive things, but it's important to recognize as these norms shift, these perceptions are still changing in different people's minds. The other thing I'll say is, it can be frustrating, right? If you have different expectations or contributions as your co-author, that can be a challenge. There's a lot of stories out there of people who agree to do a project together and then one person is bearing most of the burden. Or all of a sudden they feel like they've got the same vision, but then the vision differs in how the analysis should go or what outlet they should submit to first. And so it can be a point of stress to work with people, right? Just think about other experiences you've had working on a team. It can be a great experience, but it can be frustrating. Okay, so what do you want to think about when you're trying to decide, should I co-author? A couple of things. First, I'd say the point in your career matters. I think that at any point in your career, whether as a grad student or as a professor, you can definitely consider co-authoring. But I would say, especially earlier in your career, for me personally, I would make sure I have at least some solo projects along with my co-authorship, in part because, again, the way that many people will see you in the field, it will often be like, hey, what does this person do? What is this person's skills? What's this person's way of thinking? And if everything you do is done with 4 other people, it's tough for people to tease that out. Again, doesn't mean it's right. It could mean you're a brilliant person, you probably are, and you do great work on teams. And I think, maybe a generation from now, those norms will change enough that this advice won't matter. But for now, I think there's still some of that where doing co-authorship is good, but doing some solo stuff is also good. Now, on co-authorship in particular, project itself matters. And of course, the person you collaborate with matters, right? Do you get along with them personally, but also professionally, right? You don't necessarily just want your best friend if you can't hold each other accountable. You need to be able to do that as colleagues. Do you have potentially complementary skills, right? Are you really good at theory generation? They're really good at statistical analysis or interviews or something else? That can be a great way to co-author. Do you have similar expectations for the project and where it's going to be placed? That's really important to kind of get that stuff out of the way at the outset, as I'll talk about more in a moment. Power dynamics matter, right? It doesn't mean that you can't co-author with someone who's, a senior professor if you're a grad student or vice versa, but that can play into the dynamics of the co-authorship or the partnership, right? Is it really equal in terms of who has a say, or is it not? And if it's not, are those things clearly delineated at the outset? What is going to be the order of authorship and the ultimate piece? All of those things you want to think through at the outset and talk to your potential co-author or collaborator on, because again, there's not just one correct agreement or dynamic, but the dynamics that are going to work are those on which people are transparent about and understand about at the beginning before you decide to launch that project to save yourself a lot of headache and heartache down the line. Next consideration, are you thinking about an article versus, as Phil mentioned before, an edited volume? An edited volume is kind of a whole other kettle of fish there, in the sense that an article, it's a one-shot deal. It takes a lot of work, but you kind of do the article and that's kind of that. An edited volume, you're not just potentially being a co-editor, which I have done now on 2 different volumes, but you're also then editing 10 to up to 35 different people's chapters. So in many ways, you're collaborating with all of those people, especially if you're the editor. And so that can be a challenge. I always think that the term, herding cats, which is used a lot in academia, comes from people who were editors of edited volumes. Because again, let's say you've got 12 chapters, if you've got 15 or 20 or 30 chapters, and all of them get turned in except for 2. It's like, hey, what do? Do you go forward with the volume and cut those 2 that came in late? Do you wait for them, but then you're holding up everybody else who needs this publication to go forward? So it's a huge challenge, not just for you individually with the personality of who you're co-editing with or collaborating with, but people have different timelines, different ways of doing work. It's a real challenge. And so, especially if you're doing an edited volume, you need to be extra careful to set up front, what are the expectations for when things are due? What are the themes that people are writing on? What's the style of it? Because again, now you're not just doing individual stovepipe pieces. In a good edited volume, they're supposed to complement each other, speak to each other. So it takes even more kind of hand-holding and engaged collaboration on your part if you're going to do that. For all those reasons, it's something I usually don't recommend to grad students to co-edit, or edit a volume. That's a good thing usually to think about once you're at least maybe a postdoc, if not a professor. But if you want to write in a volume, that's another issue. But collaborating at that level, not just on an article, but edited volume, I think is something that's worth waiting until a bit later. Also because, again, unfortunately, as much as it's a huge amount of work, sometimes some people don't give you as much credit for editing a volume, of course, as like writing your own monograph or things of that nature. So again, getting your ducks in a row, especially if you're concerned about tenure, these are important things to understand. Final things I'll say, make sure again that you have that in-depth meeting to talk about all of this stuff before the project. Personal idiosyncrasies, how you do your work, division of responsibilities, timeline, desired publication outlets, order of authorship. Is it by who does the most work? Is it by last name? Is it, we're going to do a random number generator? Again, sometimes people leave that to the end. And then all of a sudden someone might be like, hey, I did more of the work. I should be the first author, or, oh, etc. I'm the senior person. Make sure you hash that out at the outset. And also, you're going to have to talk about this stuff in your tenure file. When you go up for tenure, you have to usually fill out for any co-authored or collaborated project, what was the work that you put in? And so having a good record of that from the outset is a great way to go. And then finally, make sure you have a good regular schedule to check in with your co-author and your collaborator. Just like you set deadlines for yourself before a conference or before something else is due, do the same thing. Have those regular check-ins. The collaborations that I've done, which have gone great, go well because I have good regular communication with the people I'm working with. So in any case, good luck if you do it. I'm sure all of you will get a chance to collaborate or co-author at some point. And it's really rewarding, but just make sure you plan accordingly.
All right, well, that's great. Yeah, one of the things I like about co-authorship is single authorship is great in terms of autonomy, but it can be lonely. And so you trade different kind of problems when you do an edited group, and particularly if you're with a group of individuals that you really get along with and have a shared vision. Anyway, Peter, fantastic having you here again for advice for grad students. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Phil.